You know what's funny? Claire Bennett said loudly, slamming a cinnamon latte onto the tiny round cafe table. Billionaires always smile while they ruin your life. The early morning crowd inside Bennett and Bean Cafe went unusually quiet. Steam hissed from the espresso machine behind the counter. Rain tapped softly against the windows facing West 14th Street. Claire didn't notice the silence at first because she was too frustrated, too exhausted, and honestly too broke to care anymore. Her blonde hair was twisted into a messy knot, graphite smudged across her fingers from sketching logos all night for a client who still hadn't paid her. Across from her, her best friend Megan lowered her voice immediately. "Claire," she whispered carefully. "Maybe don't yell that in public." But Claire was already spiraling. "No, seriously," she continued, pushing her half-eaten blueberry muffin aside. "This Ethan Callaway guy buys one block in Manhattan, and suddenly rent jumps 30%. Families get kicked out. Local shops disappear. But hey, at least he gets another glass skyscraper with his name on it." A couple near the pastry display exchanged awkward looks. Even the barista stopped wiping cups. Claire rolled her eyes dramatically. Guys like him don't even belong in neighborhoods like this. They destroy places they've never actually lived in. Then a calm male voice behind her said, "That bad, huh?" Her stomach dropped instantly. Slowly, Claire turned around in her chair. Standing there, less than 3 feet away, was a tall man in a charcoal gray sweater holding a plain black coffee. No bodyguards, no designer suit, no flashy watch, just sharp blue eyes and an unreadable expression that suddenly made the entire cafe feel 10 degrees colder. Claire recognized him immediately from magazine covers and business interviews. Ethan Callaway, billionaire founder of Callaway Group. The man she had just publicly destroyed for the last 2 minutes. Megan actually covered her face with both hands. Someone near the register muttered, "Oh my God." Claire felt heat rush into her cheeks so fast she thought she might pass out. She started, but nothing intelligent followed. Ethan glanced around the silent cafe before looking back at her. "Please," he said calmly. "Continue. I'm interested now." His voice wasn't angry. That somehow made it worse. Claire stood up too quickly, nearly knocking over her chair. "Look, I didn't realize that I was standing behind you," he finished softly. A tiny smirk touched the corner of his mouth. Not mocking, almost amused. Claire wanted to disappear. Instead, she crossed her arms defensively. "Fine," she said. "You want honesty? People here are scared because of you." Ethan studied her face for a long second, like he was trying to solve a puzzle nobody else noticed. Then his eyes drifted toward the sketchbook beside her coffee cup, pages filled with hand-drawn cafe designs and logo concepts. His expression shifted slightly. Curious now. Interested. Dangerous in an entirely different way. Outside, thunder rolled over Manhattan, while Ethan Callaway quietly asked the question that would change both their lives forever. "Tell me," he said, stepping closer to her table. "What exactly do you think I destroyed?" Claire could feel every pair of eyes inside the cafe locked onto her, while Ethan Callaway stood beside her table, holding his coffee like this was somehow the most normal conversation in Manhattan. Her heartbeat slammed against her ribs. "You really want me to answer that?" she asked carefully. Ethan pulled out the empty chair across from her without waiting for permission. "You were confident 30 seconds ago." A nervous laugh escaped from someone near the counter. Megan kicked Claire lightly under the table as if begging her to stop talking before she accidentally insulted one of the richest men in America again. But Claire was already too embarrassed to back down now. "Fine," she said, crossing her arms. "You buy buildings. Rent goes up. Local businesses disappear. People who actually built this neighborhood cannot afford to stay here anymore." Ethan stirred his coffee once, slow and thoughtful. "And you know this because?" Claire leaned forward instantly. "Because my parents lost everything when developers came into our town in Connecticut when I was 16. Small stores closed. My father's hardware shop survived exactly 8 months before some giant chain pushed everyone out." Ethan's expression changed slightly at that. Not defensive, not angry, just quieter somehow. "So now every wealthy person becomes the villain in your story?" Claire opened her mouth immediately, but hesitated. The frustrating part was how calm he stayed. She wanted arrogance. She wanted entitlement. Instead, Ethan looked genuinely interested in what she was saying. "You know what the worst part is?" Claire continued softly. People like you call it progress while everybody else just calls it goodbye. The cafe went silent again. Even the milk steamer stopped hissing. Ethan looked down briefly at the sketchbook beside her elbow. You draw professionally? Claire blinked at the sudden subject change. Freelance branding and illustration. That your work? She glanced at the open page and quickly pulled the sketchbook closer. Too late. He had already seen the hand-drawn logo concepts and cafe interior designs covering the paper. It is nothing important, she muttered. Ethan surprised her again by smiling slightly. Usually when someone says that, it means it matters a lot. Claire hated how easily he said things like that. Like he could see directly through people. Megan finally stood up awkwardly. I am going to grab another coffee and pretend this conversation is not happening. She disappeared toward the counter immediately. Claire exhaled hard and rubbed her forehead. Look, I know I probably sound rude. You sound honest, Ethan corrected. That is different. For the first time since he sat down, Claire looked directly into his eyes without anger. They were colder than she expected, but tired too. Exhausted, almost. Like a man who had not slept properly in years. Ethan glanced around the cafe slowly before asking, You come here every morning? Most mornings. Same table. Usually. He nodded once, thoughtful again. Then his phone buzzed sharply against the table. The screen lit up with headlines and notifications from people Claire could never imagine texting casually. Board meeting moved to 8 a.m. Call from London. Property acquisition finalized. Ethan silenced the phone without even looking stressed. Claire noticed the headline before she could stop herself. Property acquisition finalized. Her stomach tightened immediately. Another neighborhood? She asked coldly. Ethan slipped the phone into his coat pocket. Business never stops. Claire leaned back in her chair. Neither does damage. For a second, something flashed across Ethan's face. Not anger. Something heavier. Then he stood up slowly, placing a crisp $20 bill beside her untouched latte. You are not wrong about everything, Claire Bennett. She froze. I never told you my last name. Ethan glanced back at her with the faintest hint of amusement. No, he said quietly. But your sketchbook did. Then he walked toward the door while the entire cafe watched him leave through the rain-soaked Manhattan street. And somehow Claire could not stop thinking about the fact that he never once denied any of her accusations. Claire told herself she was never going back to Bennett and Bean at 7:15 in the morning again. Unfortunately, cheap rent on freelance office space did not exist in Manhattan, and the cafe had free wireless internet strong enough to upload her design files before client deadlines. So 3 days later, she pushed open the glass door carrying her laptop bag, fully prepared to pretend Ethan Calloway no longer existed. Then she saw him immediately. Same corner table. Same charcoal sweater. Same black coffee. He looked up from his laptop the second she walked in. Almost like he had been expecting her. Claire stopped mid-step. You have got to be kidding me, she muttered under her breath. Ethan closed his laptop calmly. Good morning, Claire. She narrowed her eyes suspiciously. Do billionaires not have offices? Several. Then why are you here? The coffee is better. Claire glanced at Megan behind the register. Megan instantly avoided eye contact because she was obviously enjoying this far too much. Claire dropped her bag onto the chair furthest from Ethan and sat down dramatically. You know, normal people usually avoid places where they get publicly insulted. Ethan took a slow sip of coffee without looking bothered. Normal people also do not usually tell the truth to my face. That answer irritated her more than it should have. For the next hour, Claire tried focusing on work while secretly noticing everything about him. He barely touched his phone. He thanked employees by name. When an older man near the counter accidentally dropped his drink, Ethan stood up first to help clean it. No cameras. No performance. No assistant documenting his kindness for social media. Just instinct. Claire hated that she noticed. Around 8:30, the cafe suddenly became crowded with morning commuters escaping cold October rain outside. Every table filled quickly. A young mother entered carrying a toddler while balancing a stroller and 2 shopping bags. She looked exhausted. Before the woman could even ask, Ethan stood and offered his table immediately. Please, he said simply. You need it more than I do. The woman looked stunned. Thank you. Ethan gave a polite nod and moved toward the counter instead, standing beside Claire's table now. You did not have to give up your seat, Claire said quietly before she could stop herself. Ethan shrugged lightly. I can afford to stand. Claire almost smiled at that. Almost. Then she noticed something folded beside his coffee cup. Her stomach tightened instantly. It was one of her sketches. The cafe concept she had been drawing days ago. Warm wood interiors, hanging Edison lights, local art on exposed brick walls. The tiny dream she never showed anyone because it felt childish compared to unpaid invoices and overdue rent. "Why do you have that?" she asked sharply. Ethan looked down at the sketch carefully. "You left it behind, so you kept it." It seemed important. Claire reached for the paper immediately, but Ethan pulled it back slightly. "Not teasing. Studying it. You designed this?" "It is just a sketch." "No," Ethan said softly. "It is a future." The words hit harder than they should have. Claire looked away quickly. Nobody had spoken about her work like that before. Most clients treated creativity like fast food. Cheap. Replaceable. Ethan folded the sketch carefully and handed it back to her. Their fingers brushed for half a second. Warm. Steady. Dangerous in an entirely different way now. Then his phone buzzed again against the counter. Claire glanced down accidentally and saw the notification before he could silence it. Call regarding West 14th property redevelopment. Her expression hardened immediately. There it was again. The reminder of who he really was. Ethan noticed the shift in her face instantly. "Claire," he started quietly. But she already grabbed her sketch and shoved it into her bag. "Do not," she interrupted coldly. "Do not make me forget what you do for a living." Ethan stared at her for a long second while rain hammered harder against the cafe windows, and for the first time since meeting her, he looked genuinely disappointed. For the next 2 weeks, Ethan Calloway kept showing up at Bennett and Bean every single morning at exactly 7:15, and somehow that became the most confusing part of Claire's day. He always ordered the same black coffee, always sat near the window, always arrived alone. Claire tried pretending she did not notice, but her eyes searched for him now without permission. It annoyed her deeply. On Thursday morning, she walked in carrying rolled-up design prints under one arm and nearly slipped on rainwater near the entrance. Before she hit the floor, a steady hand caught her elbow instantly. "Careful," Ethan said quietly beside her. Claire froze for half a second at how naturally he had reached for her. "I had it," she muttered, even though they both knew she absolutely did not. Ethan released her arm immediately. Clearly, Claire rolled her eyes and moved toward her usual table. "You enjoy being irritating?" Only before 8 in the morning. Against her better judgment, she laughed softly. Ethan noticed. So did Megan behind the counter. Megan almost dropped a coffee mug from shock. The strange routine continued after that. Some mornings they barely spoke. Other mornings they argued about architecture, neighborhoods, money, art, and whether New York was becoming too expensive for normal people to survive in. Ethan challenged everything she said calmly, while somehow still listening harder than anyone else ever had. One morning Claire complained about a client, refusing to pay her on time. Ethan listened silently before asking, "How many hours did you spend on the project?" "Around 40. And they still delayed payment?" Claire scoffed. "Welcome to freelance life." Ethan stared at his coffee for a second. "That should not happen." "Well, it does." The next afternoon, Claire received a payment notification for the exact invoice amount she had been fighting over for 3 weeks. Attached was a short email from the client suddenly apologizing for the delay. Claire immediately suspected Ethan. The next morning, she marched into the cafe and dropped her phone onto his table. "You called my client?" Ethan looked genuinely confused for a moment before realizing what happened. "I encouraged accountability. You cannot just interfere in people's lives because you have money. Would you rather not be paid?" Claire opened her mouth, then stopped. Ethan leaned back slightly, studying her again with that frustratingly calm expression. "You are welcome, by the way." She hated that part too, because she was grateful. One cold Friday morning, the cafe owner, Mrs. Ramirez, stood behind the counter looking close to tears while reviewing paperwork. Claire overheard enough to understand the problem immediately. Rent increase. Again, Mrs. Ramirez had owned Bennett and Bean for almost 19 years. "I do not know how much longer we can survive this," she whispered quietly to Megan. Claire's stomach sank. Ethan walked in 10 minutes later and instantly noticed the mood shift inside the cafe. His eyes moved from Claire to Mrs. Ramirez to the stack of papers near the register. "What happened?" he asked softly. Claire crossed her arms. "Exactly what always happens." Ethan picked up the paperwork carefully and scanned the numbers. His jaw tightened almost invisibly. "This increase is absurd," he said quietly. Claire blinked in surprise. You are literally a billionaire developer. Which means I understand numbers. Mrs. Ramirez forced a small smile. It is okay. We will figure something out. But Claire could hear fear hiding underneath her voice. Ethan folded the paperwork slowly before handing it back. Maybe, he said carefully, you should not have to. Claire watched him closely then. Really closely. Because for the first time since meeting Ethan Callaway, she saw something she never expected to see in a man like him. Guilt. Claire started noticing Ethan in ways she did not want to admit. The way he always arrived before sunrise like someone trying to outrun his own thoughts. The way he loosened his tie halfway through difficult phone calls. The way he stared out the cafe windows whenever conversations around him became too loud, as if silence was the only luxury money could not buy. But the worst part was that he remembered things. Small things. Human things. One freezing Tuesday morning, Claire walked into Bennett and Bean shivering after carrying presentation boards across 6 rainy Manhattan blocks. Before she even reached her table, Ethan slid a fresh cup of hot chocolate toward her without looking up from his laptop. You hate black coffee when you are cold, he said simply. Claire stared at the drink suspiciously. That is creepy. You say that every time I remember something about you. Because normal people do not memorize beverage patterns. Ethan finally looked up with the faintest smile. You are around me for 2 hours every morning. It would be strange not to notice. Claire hated how reasonable that sounded. She sat down across from him carefully. You know this changes absolutely nothing, right? I know. I still disagree with almost everything your industry does. Also aware of that. Good. Ethan nodded once toward the hot chocolate. Then drink it before it gets cold. Claire tried not to smile while wrapping her hands around the warm cup. Across the cafe, Megan watched the interaction like it was live television. Later that morning, Claire stayed after the rush to help Mrs. Ramirez reorganize supply shelves in the back storage room. Halfway through stacking pastry boxes, she overheard muffled voices near the office doorway. Ethan's voice. Low. Serious. How far behind are you? Mrs. Ramirez sighed heavily. 3 months on the increase. I have been trying to catch up. Claire froze quietly behind the shelves. And the landlord? Ethan asked. He already warned me. This place may not survive winter. Silence followed for a few seconds before Ethan spoke again. Do not sign anything yet. Mrs. Ramirez sounded confused. What does that mean? It means give me 48 hours. Claire stepped backward accidentally, knocking over a stack of paper cups. Both of them turned immediately. Ethan's eyes met hers first. Calm as always. Eavesdropping, he asked softly. Claire crossed her arms defensively. You do realize mysterious billionaire conversations sound suspicious, right? Mrs. Ramirez laughed tiredly before leaving them alone. The second she disappeared, Claire looked directly at Ethan. What are you doing? Ethan leaned lightly against the counter. Trying to solve a problem. By buying another building? Not every solution involves ownership, Claire. Most billionaire solutions do. Ethan studied her carefully again. You really believe people cannot change once they have money? Claire looked down briefly at the wooden floor. I believe money makes it easier to stop caring. Ethan absorbed that quietly. Then he asked the one question she never expected. Who stopped caring about you? The cafe suddenly felt too small. Too warm. Claire swallowed hard and looked away toward the rainy windows. My father trusted investors when I was younger, she admitted softly. They promised jobs, growth, better opportunities. 6 months later, his store closed and they left town richer than before. Ethan remained silent. No interruption. No defense. That somehow made it harder to talk. After that, Claire continued quietly. I stopped believing wealthy people saw normal families as real people. Ethan looked at her for a long moment before saying something so honest it caught her completely off guard. Sometimes they do not. Claire blinked slowly. She expected denial. Maybe even offense. Not agreement. Ethan glanced toward the front windows where New York traffic blurred through falling rain. The dangerous part, he said quietly, is when success becomes large enough that nobody around you says no anymore. Claire stared at him differently then. Because for the first time, Ethan Callaway did not sound like a billionaire. Defending his world. He sounded like a man trapped inside it. By November, Ethan Callaway had become part of the cafe's daily rhythm in a way nobody could explain. Mrs. Ramirez automatically started making his coffee the second he walked through the door. Megan saved the corner outlet near the window for his laptop charger without asking. And Claire had stopped pretending she did not look for him every morning the second she entered Bennett and Bean. That terrified her more than anything else. One Wednesday evening, Manhattan was buried under freezing rain and heavy traffic. The cafe stayed open late because customers kept pouring inside to escape the weather. Claire sat at her usual table surrounded by sketches, invoices, and a half-finished branding project she was dangerously close to losing sleep over. Ethan remained across from her reviewing contracts on his tablet, while jazz music played softly through the speakers overhead. Neither of them spoke much that night. Somehow the silence felt comfortable now. Around 9:30, the lights flickered once, then twice. Mrs. Ramirez sighed from behind the counter. Not again. Ethan looked up immediately. Electrical problems? Old building, she explained tiredly. The landlord keeps delaying repairs. A loud popping sound suddenly came from the kitchen area before half the cafe lost power completely. Customers groaned while Megan scrambled for flashlights behind the counter. Claire stood quickly. Is everybody okay? We are fine, Mrs. Ramirez answered, though she looked close to panic. I just cannot afford another repair this month. Ethan had already removed his coat and rolled up his sleeves before anyone finished speaking. Claire blinked in surprise. What are you doing? Trying to stop your favorite cafe from catching fire. You know electrical systems? Claire, he said dryly while loosening his tie. I grew up in Ohio before I became rich, not on the moon. 20 minutes later, Ethan was kneeling near the back breaker panel with a flashlight while rain hammered violently against the windows outside. Claire crouched beside him holding tools Megan found in storage. Hand me the insulated screwdriver, he said calmly. She passed it over silently. You seem very confident for someone whose entire career involves buying expensive buildings. Ethan glanced sideways at her briefly. My father repaired factory machines for 30 years. He made sure I learned how to fix things before I learned how to manage them. Claire stared at him. You never talk about your family. Ethan focused on the wiring again. Most interviews only care about stock prices. The answer sat heavily between them. A few minutes later, the lights suddenly flickered back on across the cafe. Customers clapped instinctively. Megan actually cheered. Mrs. Ramirez nearly cried with relief. Ethan stood slowly, sleeves rolled halfway up his forearms, looking more exhausted than proud. Claire watched him differently again. This version of Ethan never appeared in magazines. The billionaire who repaired breaker panels during rainstorms instead of leaving problems for assistants. Mrs. Ramirez hugged Ethan tightly before he could protest. You just saved me at least $2,000. Ethan smiled softly. Then buy better pastries with it. Everyone laughed except Claire because she was too busy noticing the way Ethan looked at ordinary people. Like they mattered. Like he saw them. Later that night, after the customers finally left, Claire helped stack chairs onto tables while Ethan gathered his things near the door. You surprised me tonight, she admitted quietly. Ethan buttoned his coat slowly. That sounds dangerous. Claire smiled despite herself. Do not get used to it. For a second, neither of them moved. Rain streaked down the windows behind him while soft yellow light filled the nearly empty cafe. Ethan reached into his leather folder carefully and pulled out the folded cafe sketch she accidentally left weeks ago. I still think this place should exist someday, he said softly. Claire took the paper slowly from his hand. Their fingers brushed again. Familiar now. You kept this the entire time? Ethan looked at her steadily. Some things are worth holding on to. Claire's heartbeat stumbled unexpectedly. Then Ethan's phone buzzed sharply, cutting through the moment like broken glass. He glanced down at the screen, and for the first time in weeks, Claire watched warmth disappear completely from his expression. Board vote approved. West 14th redevelopment moves forward Monday morning. Claire saw the message reflected faintly in the screen before Ethan locked it immediately. Silence filled the space between them. Heavy. Wrong. Claire slowly stepped backward. Ethan, she said quietly, what exactly is being redeveloped? The next morning, Ethan did not come to the cafe. Neither did the morning after that. Claire told herself the silence should have felt like relief. Instead, Bennett and Bean suddenly seemed colder without him sitting near the window pretending not to watch her sketch between client emails. By Friday afternoon, Manhattan was covered in sharp November wind and gray skies when Megan rushed toward Claire holding her phone. You need to see this. Claire barely looked up from her laptop. If this is another celebrity breakup, I genuinely cannot care less. Claire. Megan's voice sounded different this time. Serious. Claire finally took the phone. Her stomach dropped instantly. Callaway Group announces West 14th Luxury Redevelopment Project. Underneath the headline was a digital rendering of a massive glass tower replacing almost the entire neighborhood block surrounding Bennett and Bean. Claire's chest tightened so hard she could barely breathe. The cafe, the bookstore next door, the flower shop on the corner. Gone. She kept scrolling with numb fingers until she saw the line that destroyed whatever hope she still had left. Project approved directly under CEO Ethan Callaway. No, Claire whispered. Megan looked heartbroken for her. I am so sorry. Claire stood so quickly her chair slammed against the floor. He knew, she said quietly. The whole time, he knew. Rain poured heavily outside while she grabbed her coat and stormed out into Manhattan traffic without thinking. By the time she reached Callaway Group headquarters 20 blocks uptown, she was soaked completely through. The enormous lobby looked exactly how Claire imagined Billionaire power would look. White marble floors, gold lighting, security guards in tailored suits, a giant digital screen displaying stock prices and luxury developments around the world. Claire marched straight toward the front desk. I need to see Ethan Callaway. The receptionist gave her a practiced smile. Do you have an appointment? No, but apparently he had one with my entire neighborhood. Several employees glanced over awkwardly. The receptionist opened her mouth carefully. Miss, I cannot just let you, Claire. Ethan's voice came from behind her. She turned instantly. He stood near the elevators wearing a dark navy suit, surrounded by executives carrying tablets and folders. The sight hit her harder than she expected. This was the real Ethan. Not the man fixing breaker panels and rolled-up sleeves at midnight. Not the man buying her hot chocolate on freezing mornings. This version belonged to skyscrapers and billion-dollar decisions. Ethan dismissed the executives immediately. Give us a minute. Claire held up her phone with the redevelopment article shaking in her hand. You lied to me. Ethan's jaw tightened. Claire, it is more complicated than that. No, she snapped. It is actually very simple. You sat in that cafe every single day while planning to destroy it. People across the lobby had started watching now. Ethan lowered his voice carefully. I was trying to stop the board from approving the full demolition. Claire laughed bitterly. That is supposed to make me feel better? You do not understand how these negotiations work. And you do not understand how betrayal works. The word landed visibly. Ethan stepped closer carefully. I never wanted you hurt by this. Claire's eyes burned with humiliation. That is the problem, Ethan. You do not get to play the thoughtful billionaire while signing papers that erase people's lives. Silence crashed between them. Every employee nearby pretended not to stare. Claire reached into her bag suddenly and pulled out the folded cafe sketch he returned days earlier. The paper was worn now from being opened too many times. You said this was a future, she said quietly, voice trembling. Turns out it was just another thing you wanted people to believe. Then she threw the sketch onto the marble floor between them. Ethan looked down at it like it physically hurt him to see it there. Claire, he said softly, but she stepped backward immediately. Do not come back to Bennett and Bean. Her voice broke slightly on the last word. You do not belong there anymore. Then Claire turned and walked straight out of Callaway Group headquarters into the freezing New York rain, while Ethan remained standing completely still beside the sketch she once trusted him to hold. For 3 straight days, Ethan Callaway never returned to Bennett and Bean. Claire pretended that did not bother her. She focused on work, ignored Megan's worried looks, and tried convincing herself she had finally seen the truth clearly. Billionaires always chose business in the end. That was the lesson. That had always been the lesson. But by Monday morning, something felt wrong. The cafe was unusually tense. Mrs. Ramirez stood frozen behind the counter staring at her laptop, while customers whispered around her. What happened? Claire asked carefully. Mrs. Ramirez looked up slowly, eyes wide with confusion. I do not understand this. She turned the screen around. Claire stepped closer and read the headline twice because her brain refused to process it the first time. Callaway Group suspends West 14th redevelopment project after emergency board revote. Claire blinked hard. What? Megan grabbed another article immediately. Read this part. Claire scanned lower down the page. Callaway Group also announces 15-year protected lease agreements for small businesses impacted by original proposal. Her heartbeat slowed strangely. That cannot be real. Then the cafe door opened. Every conversation inside Bennett and Bean stopped immediately. Ethan walked in wearing a dark wool coat with exhaustion written across his face. He looked like a man who had not slept in days. Claire stared at him silently, while Mrs. Ramirez rushed around the counter first. "Please tell me this article is true." Ethan nodded once. "Your lease is protected." Mrs. Ramirez covered her mouth with both hands. "For 15 years? Yes." Tears instantly filled her eyes. Megan hugged her tightly while customers around the cafe started murmuring in disbelief. Claire remained completely still. Ethan looked only at her. "Can we talk?" he asked quietly. Claire hesitated before walking toward the back hallway near the storage room. The second they were alone, she crossed her arms defensively. "What happened?" Ethan loosened his tie slowly like he no longer had energy left for masks. "The board approved demolition because the project would make billions. I know that part. I spent the last 72 hours buying controlling interest from 3 major investors, so I could override the vote." Claire stared at him. "You what?" Ethan leaned against the wall tiredly. "The project is gone." "Just like that?" "Not exactly." He gave a humorless smile. "My shareholders are currently furious with me." Claire searched his face carefully. "Why would you do that?" Ethan looked at her for a long second before answering. "Because you were right." The words hit harder than she expected. Ethan glanced toward the cafe quietly. "I built my career convincing myself redevelopment always meant improvement." His voice sounded rough now. Honest. "Then I sat in that cafe every morning and realized I was preparing to erase people who actually mattered." Claire swallowed hard, but said nothing. Ethan reached into his coat pocket carefully and pulled out a folded piece of paper. Her sketch. The cafe design. Still slightly wrinkled from where she threw it onto the marble floor days earlier. "I picked it up after you left," he said softly. Claire stared down at the drawing silently. Ethan continued carefully. "Do you remember what you said to me the first day we met?" She looked up slowly. Ethan's expression softened. "You said men like me destroy places we never belonged to." Rain tapped softly against the back windows while the cafe buzzed faintly in the distance. "I could not stop thinking about that," he admitted quietly. Claire felt emotion tighten painfully in her chest. Ethan handed her the sketch gently. "So I decided to finally build something worth belonging to instead." Claire unfolded the paper slowly. There was something new written across the bottom corner in Ethan's handwriting. "Bennett and Bean. Community Arts Studio Proposal." Claire looked up in shock. Ethan rubbed the back of his neck almost nervously for the first time since she met him. "The empty property upstairs becomes available next month," he said carefully. "I thought maybe your future should have an actual address." 3 months later, the second floor above Bennett and Bean smelled like fresh paint, espresso, and sawdust. Warm Edison lights glowed against exposed brick walls while local artists hung framed sketches across the studio Claire once believed would never exist outside her imagination. A gold sign near the staircase read Bennett and Bean Community Art Studio in elegant lettering designed by Claire herself. The grand opening crowd filled nearly every corner of the building. Local musicians played soft jazz near the windows. Neighborhood families wandered through the gallery space smiling. Mrs. Ramirez cried at least twice before 7 o'clock. Claire stood near the center of the studio holding a paper cup of champagne while Megan adjusted decorations for the 5th time. "You know," Megan said, looking around proudly, "most people flirt by texting. You accidentally bullied a billionaire into saving an entire neighborhood." Claire laughed softly. "Trust me, that was not the strategy." But even while smiling, her eyes kept drifting toward the staircase. Ethan still had not arrived, which should not have mattered as much as it did. After the redevelopment disaster, things between them changed quietly. Softer, more careful. Ethan still came to the cafe some mornings, but now there were no walls left between who he was in public and who he was privately. Claire had watched him argue against executives during interviews. She had seen him fund local business grants without attaching his name anywhere. He never asked for praise. Somehow that mattered most. "Stop looking at the door every 30 seconds, Megan whispered smugly. "I am not." Claire. Before she could deny it again, the front entrance downstairs opened. The entire room shifted slightly as Ethan Calloway walked inside wearing a black wool coat dusted with snow from the December streets outside. Conversations quieted. Instinctively, Some people still stared at him like he belonged on magazine covers instead of standing inside a neighborhood art studio. But Ethan barely noticed any of it. His eyes found Claire immediately and stayed there. Claire felt her heartbeat stumble exactly the same way it had the first morning he stood behind her in the cafe. Ethan moved through the crowd slowly until he reached her. "You are late," she said softly. Ethan glanced toward the overflowing studio space around them. "I had to stop downstairs." "Why?" He handed her a small envelope carefully. "Final paperwork." Claire opened it slowly. Inside was the official ownership transfer for the second-floor studio space. Her name, not Callaway Group. Hers. Claire looked up immediately. "Ethan, no investors. No hidden contracts," he said quietly. "It belongs to you." Emotion tightened painfully in her chest. "You did not have to do this." Ethan smiled faintly. "I know." Music drifted softly through the studio while snow fell outside the windows overlooking West 14th Street. For a moment, neither of them spoke. They simply stood there surrounded by the future that almost disappeared before it ever began. Claire looked down at the familiar folded cafe sketch still tucked carefully inside the envelope. "You kept this all these months." Ethan nodded once. "Why?" His expression softened in a way she had never seen during interviews or board meetings or crowded Manhattan events. Just Ethan now. Honest. Tired. Real. "Because," he said quietly, "it was the first honest thing anyone ever said to me." Claire stared at him silently while warmth spread through her chest, so suddenly it almost hurt. Then she laughed softly and shook her head. "You know," she said, stepping slightly closer. "For a man who builds skyscrapers, you were surprisingly terrible at first impressions." Ethan smiled fully this time. "Rare. Genuine. And for someone who hated billionaires," he replied gently, "you gave one a second chance anyway." Snow continued falling outside while the lights from Bennett and Bean glowed warmly beneath them. And for the first time in a very long time, Claire realized the safest feeling in the world was not being rescued by someone powerful. It was being truly seen by someone willing to change.